Good morning. In this speech, good morning. Today I'm going to speak about the United Nations 75th anniversary's official theme, Shaping Our Future Together. In this speech, I'm going to briefly summarize the United Nations goals and achievements so far and look towards its future opportunities for encouraging the Earth's people and countries to live democratically, to cooperate peacefully, to respect each other, and to care for the environment. In 1945, World War II ended and the United Nations was established by 51 states or governments. In 2020, the United Nations has 193 members. The United Nations goals are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, and promote social progress, better living standards, and human rights. It was very understandable for these goals to be written in the United Nations Charter, especially after the devastating World War II, where an estimated 60 to 85 million people had died. The United Nations has tried to be a far more successful international organization than its predecessor, the League of Nations, had been. Contrary to the League of Nations, the United Nations has had the United States as one of its member states right from the start. The United Nations designed the Security Council to be an international forum for resolving the world's armed conflicts peacefully. 5 countries became its permanent members, and they have the right to veto or block the Security Council's proposed resolutions. Those countries are the United States, Russia, France, Britain, and China. In addition, the United Nations General Assembly elects 10 non-permanent members to the Security Council for a 2-year term. The United Nations' other main organs are the Secretariat, the United Nations Economic and Social Council, or UNESCO, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. During the terms of the first General Secretary of the United Nations, Mr. Trygve Lie from Norway, the United Nations was involved in relief efforts for Europe, Africa, and Asia, in Asia's decolonization, and in the Korean War. When Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld from Sweden served as the second Secretary General of the United Nations, the decolonization of Asia accelerated, and that process basically started in Africa. Also, there was a temporary easing of the US-Soviet tensions. Secretary General Hammarskjöld was tragically killed in an airplane crash while on a peace mission to Africa. So far, he's the only UN Secretary General to have died in office. During his term, the United Nations humanitarian aid, diplomatic efforts, and peacekeeping forces gradually became known and appreciated in different parts of the world. Decolonization mostly ended in Asia and Africa during the 10-year term of Secretary General U Thant from Burma, currently Myanmar. He worked behind the scenes to contribute to the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Around this time, the United Nations gradually began to focus more on promoting the environment's protection due to the world's quickly rising pollution rates. During the 10-year term of Secretary General Kurt Waldheim from Austria, the United Nations participated more in peacekeeping missions and tried to promote a peaceful dialogue between the democracies and communist countries in the spirit of détente. The Communist China inherited Taiwan's seat on the Security Council. Meanwhile, the Afro-Asian bloc of former colonies became increasingly influential in the United Nations. At last, the Cold War ended during the 10-year term of Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar from Peru. One of the United Nations' major achievements at this time was the peacefully negotiated end of Namibia's occupation by South Africa. Such post-Cold War issues as globalization, sustainable development, the developing countries' efforts to become first world countries, democratization, and the women's and girls' educational and occupational equality efforts became increasingly discussed during the 5-year term of Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali from Egypt. Various summits were held especially on the environmental and human rights issues. These efforts continued during the 10-year term of Secretary General Kofi Annan from Ghana. In 2005, the United Nations members established two new intergovernmental bodies, the Peacebuilding Commission and the Human Rights Council. General Secretary Annan likewise played a central role in the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS. During the 10-year term of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon from South Korea, the Millennium Development Goals generated $60 billion in pledges. Climate summits became more common. Another UN organ was established, UN Women. The United Nations sent aid notably to Myanmar, Haiti, and Pakistan during their natural disasters and promoted the transition to democracy in North Africa and Western Asia. The United Nations current Secretary General Antonio Guterres from Portugal has focused on making human dignity the core of his work and to serve as a peace broker, a bridge builder, and a promoter of reform and innovation. Human rights have been a priority for him due to his earlier service as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Two of the United Nations' top priorities at this moment are to strengthen the world's democracies during the current COVID-19 pandemic and to channel more funds into healthcare, education, poverty reduction, and employment programs. During the United Nations' existence, many thousands of volunteers have served in these kinds of projects on the world's continents, and these efforts continue. The recent advances in the girls' and women's equal access to education and employment, as well as the rise in the number of female entrepreneurs in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, increase the hopes for more democratic human rights, economic, and social breakthroughs in the future. Since the late 20th century, the United Nations has worked patiently to train the developing countries' people to establish infrastructure, health centers, hospitals, schools, social work centers, and other important parts of the socio-economic framework more independently. Gradually, significant results have been achieved, and these advances are set to continue in the 21st century. The United Nations has also sent many election observers and advisors to the emerging democracies, and nowadays many Asian, African, and Latin American countries have more free and fair elections and more peaceful transitions of political power than before the 21st century. Peaceful cooperation between countries, organizations, and individuals has been demonstrated to work quite smoothly during the current pandemic. For example, some African countries have sent vaccines and other medications to each other in order to overcome the COVID-19 virus. Prominent among the United Nations educational programs are the ones which encourage the students to find out more about the other ethnic and racial groups, cultures, languages, and religions with an open and objective mind. Such efforts have significantly reduced racism and have indirectly contributed to establishment of many international schools worldwide. Many schools, organizations, businesses, and countries around the world now prioritize the environment's protection. A growing number of people eat more vegetable-based diets, recycle their waste, use environmentally friendlier products, practice organic farming, reduce the use of motor vehicles, and engage in ecological tourism. In conclusion, the United Nations has had many ups and downs during its 75-year existence, but we all trust that its best days are still ahead. Despite the problems and hardships, that this fine international organization has experienced, it has not only survived, but it has also gradually grown, strengthened, and increased its achievements. Happy 75th anniversary to you, the United Nations, and all our best wishes for your future.